this video, I'm going to show you what you need to run OBS on your computer, where to download it, what to do during the installation process, and what initial settings to choose for the purpose of this series. So if you ever want to get started with OBS, then keep watching this video. Hi, my name is Gerd Christenadel. I'm an online educator and learning technologist at the University of Greenwich in London, UK. I share tips, how-tos and tutorials to help you build your digital skills for your online and hybrid teaching needs. If you want to stay in the loop, hit that subscribe button below and turn on notifications to avoid missing new videos released on this channel. Cheers! In my last video, I've briefly introduced you to OBS Studio as a nifty little piece of software that allows you to gain full control over your online delivery of teaching content and give your online live sessions and recordings the heart and soul of your personality. Let's get started with getting OBS on your computer. Before you do so, we need to check the minimum system requirements of your machine. Let's check the website what minimum requirements there are. So here we are on the website, OBS Studio. Link in the description below, also for the downloads, and link in the description below for the system requirements for you to reread. Let's have a look what those systems requirements actually are. So the software itself requires you to have a couple things. First and foremost, and that's very important, very useful, is that it is basically agnostic to the operating system you're running. So as you can see, it runs on Windows, Mac, and Linux and Unix systems. Now, I have a Windows system here, in fact Windows 10, so whatever you see me doing is Windows 10 related. But rest assured, the steps are very similar, if not the same, for Mac installations or Linux installations. So it says here that Windows requires to be DirectX 10.1 compatible GPU or above. Most modern systems have DirectX 11, 12 or 13. So the compatible GPU, that means it's a graphics processing unit, so basically your graphics card needs to be compatible with this standard. I leave a link in the description below how you can check if that is actually the case. And it needs at least Windows 8 to run. Most of us nowadays have Windows 10, but I know there are still Windows Vista and XP installations around. Unfortunately, on those, OBS will not run. For Mac OS, you need an Intel CPU PPC, not supported, and you need to check if your graphics card on your Mac is in fact compatible with the OpenGL 3.3 standard or above. I'll also leave a link in the description below for you to check if that is the case. And you need, as an operating system, at least Mac OS High Sierra, that's version 10.13 or later. For Unix and Linux systems, you can check the compatibility with the OpenGL 3.3 standard in the same way as for the Mac OS one. So just use the link left in the description for you in order to check if that's the case. Now, the further requirements here are that, well, it depends on what kind of GPU, what kind of graphics card you're actually sporting in your system. If you have a graphics card, a fairly modern graphics card, it should be able to provide you with hardware encoding. That's particularly important if you're actually proper streaming to YouTube, but it has also an impact on recording and has an impact on using the virtual camera. So it does not hurt if you have a graphics card that is able to hardware encode. How can you find that out? Well, I can show you later where to find your graphics card if you don't know what it's called, and then a Google search should reveal if your graphics card is able to hardware encode. Another way of finding out is in OBS, if you wanted to select hardware encoding in the settings. We get to those settings at a later point in time, but if you find that there is no entry for hardware encoding, just software encoding, then unfortunately your graphics card is not able to do that. It is important though that these settings right there only tell part of the entire story. Why? Because From my own experience, I initially ran OBS on a 3-year-old laptop at the beginning of last year's academic year that had 8 gigabytes of RAM. That's quite important to consider as well. So your random access memory and the mid-range graphics card. The problem is, well, it was sufficient for recordings in a way, but with 8 gigabytes of RAM, and if you want to use other software, so if you want to use a PowerPoint and maybe play a video to your students or other applications you might want to run via OBS, that system tended to get a bit laggy, so it had real difficulty to allocate system resources to OBS. I currently have 16 gigabytes of RAM, which is sufficient. If you have 32, that's even better, but you will never actually need more than 16 gigabytes of RAM as it stands by 2021. Also, I'm sporting a high-end graphics card, but you can get graphics cards that are more affordable, that are also able to hardware encode. If you can get your hands on one of those, it will be very beneficial to running OBS without lag and without much issues coming from the hardware itself. So if you're not sure how much RAM you have, and if you're not sure how much what the name of your graphics card is, then just let me show you quickly where you can find out. For the RAM, you need to call up your task manager. So go into your search bar and you type in task manager, run the task manager as administrator, which will prompt you. Here in the task manager, you go to the performance tab, which is right here. And then you see your memory, your RAM installed. In my case, that's 16 gigabytes. You will most likely find 8 gigabytes RAM. That's very common. If you have 4 gigabytes of RAM, sorry to tell you, but that will put OBS in front of a lot of issues. So this is how you check that. How do you check what graphics card you have? So you can Google if it's sufficient. You go down here to the Start button. You right-click on the Start button. So this little menu here starts popping up. As you can see right here. And then you go ahead and select the Device Manager. And then you need to look for your display adapters. You need to expand this. And you can see here it shows the name of my installed GPU, my graphics processing unit, which is the NVIDIA GeForce RTX 3070, as I just said earlier. So if you found yours there, just take the name, Google, and then see how powerful that graphics card is and if it's able to run OBS in a meaningful manner. So let's go ahead and download OBS. Of course, you need to know which version of Windows you actually have. If you install it on Windows, or what Mac version you have, what Linux version. To do so, then we go up to Download. And here in my case, Windows is selected as the default. And you can see that you have various versions here to download it, various options to do that. You have the installers, you can download the zip, or you can download it from a website called GitHub, which is basically a repository. I recommend using the installer. But before you do so, you need to check which version of Windows you actually have, because you might have the 32-bit version, then you need this installer, or you might have the 64-bit version. So how can you find that out? Let's have a look here in Windows, and you can see me opening the Windows button here, and I'm clicking right here on the settings. There you go, here are the settings. And in the settings, you go to System, and then you go to About, which is right here. About, click on About. And then this shows the version of Windows that you have. In my case, you find this under System Type, which is right here. So in this top part, you find information about your processor, your device name, also the installed RAM. You can find those here as well. other indications in the system at the specification, and the system type. In my case, it says 64-bit operating system. So I need to download the 64-bit version. If this says 32-bit, please do not use the domain installer. Use the one that is indicated to you. So with that in mind, let's go back and actually download the corresponding software. For that, I'm just going to go ahead and go back to our nice installation. And you download the installer right here. Once you've downloaded and ran the executable file for the OBS installation, that you are being prompted by OBS for what you want to use it for. So it says here, usage information, specify what you want to use the program for, optimize for streaming, recording secondary, optimize just for recording, I will not be streaming, and I will only be using the virtual camera. So for the purposes of this video, we are going to set it up as a virtual camera. But don't worry. What OBS does is it optimizes it for a specific purpose. But once you get the hang of the software, once you get familiar with the settings, once you have more in-depth knowledge about it, you can set up, however you initially now decided here, the software for other purposes, for streaming and for recording. However, we are going to select the virtual camera at this point. So select I will only be using the virtual camera. And say next, and then it suggests a couple of things here. It suggests a recording quality, same as stream. We're going to see what that means a little bit later today. We're going to see the base camera resolution. That's basically the resolution of your main interface here of your screen that we can change later. I will be changing it in my case. And the resolution for the output. At the moment, this is set as 1920 to 1080 or by 1080. This is where we leave it as 30 frames per second, which is basically implicating the quality of the stream as well. We're going to apply these settings, and there we go. So once you confirmed, OBS opens. And you can see here, it's a blank canvas, basically. So this black big rectangle here is where we do our screen compositions based on the sources that we're selecting. By default, down here on the left, we will populate the scenes in our software, in our OBS. This is where we create our initial 3 scenes, the 3 scenes that I've shown you in my previous video. First scene with where you see basically me as a talking head, in front of a background or just in front of my natural background. So just basically you or me, in this case, talking. The second scene is a talking head in the bottom left corner with the main screen in the background, or whatever you want to share in the background with your students or with your audience. And the third scene is the overhead camera scene, still with a talking head in the bottom left corner, but also with a camera pointed at my desk where I can perform things with my hands. So these will be the 3 scenes, and they will go in here. Over here, once we've selected a specific scene, we see the sources, and the sources are manifold. To give you a first flavor, these are the sources that we can select. Don't worry, we will go through each source, relevant source, in a separate video later in this series. Next to the sources, we have the so-called audio mixer. Currently, we have desktop audio here and the microphone audio here. You see there's nothing moving here because the inputs have not been defined yet at this point for the audio. Also, we will change a couple of settings in this video right now in order to get rid of that, because we want to have control of the audio in each individual window. Over here we have the scene transitions, so the transitions between the scenes that you can actually customize. So how should transitions look like between scenes? You can imagine this similar to PowerPoint transitions between slides. They can move in specific manners, they can dissolve, they can fly in. In this case, it's the same principle between the scenes here. And then here on the right, we have the so-called controls from top to bottom, where you can start actually doing something, like start streaming, start recording, start the virtual camera. This will be our main focus. the so-called studio mode. We talk about the studio mode a little bit later. A very useful little feature for you to prepare the stage in a way, to prepare the next screen that you might want to bring in. And here we have the settings. Now let's have a look at the settings first, and we're going to focus on very specific settings here. So you see from top to bottom we have general settings, stream settings, output, audio, video, hotkeys, and advanced settings. We will be focusing on the general settings for now, the output settings, the audio settings, and the video settings. Now at this point we are just undertaking the very basic settings. Yeah, so we're not gonna play around much with other more intricate settings that have already been predefined for us. We want to make sure that the settings are working for us in the beginning. So if we go to the General tab, there's a couple of things that we need to check first. So for example, you can change here the language. So if you prefer to use OBS in a different language, you have a couple of languages here available. And since this is open source, there's a really wide range of languages available, as you can see here. But if you prefer OBS to be used in a different language, your native language, if your mother tongue is not English, you can do so right here in the general settings. What we're gonna change here though is the theme. Currently that's the dark theme by default. This orients itself after the system settings mostly. I prefer a different theme. The so-called Rachni or Rachni theme looks a little bit different. You see that OBS is already starting to change. You see it has now different button colors here. The scene here is highlighted differently. As a personal preference, you may just try out the other themes here. So the Acri theme looks like this. It's also a very nice theme. And then we have the system theme, which focuses on your system settings. However, as I said, my personal preference is the Rachni or Rachni theme, so I'm going to go for that. All the other settings in the General tab at the moment are not really relevant. There's a couple of source alignment, snappings, projectors, system tray. You might want to have a look through and change those that you feel comfortable with. So for instance, if when you minimize OBS, then it should minimize to the system tray when started, so it should not have an entrance down in the menu bar. I just leave these things as they are because there's not any reason for me personally to change them, and it's entirely up to you if you want to change them. Let's go over to the output mode. Now in the output settings, you see also a couple of settings that we are going to change. First thing you see here on top in the output mode, when you click on the down arrow, you see that simple and advanced. In the beginning, as an OBS beginner, I would recommend that you leave this on simple. It takes care of the most relevant settings for you. If you go to advanced settings, which you of course can check, you see that you have very granular ways of setting up your recording, your audio, your stream, but for us, simple is good enough. Now, since we're not streaming at this point, we're not going to deal with video bit rates or encoders, but I just mentioned earlier, when you check your graphics card, if you want to find out via OBS if it's able to do hardware encoding, which would be preferable, then you need to check here in streaming under encoder, and you click here, and you see that I have two options here. I have software X264. That's the software encoder for the videos, so basically encoder for the videos when you record them, stream them, and the audio and the hardware. I have an hardware option here, the NVENC. That means that my graphics card is able to run this. If your graphics card is not able to run this, you will not see the entry here, just software. Then you basically have no other choice. In the recording, I would change a few things here. You might have a default for your videos. So at the moment, this recording path. So when you're recording videos, it points at your basically your standard video folder. You might want to put your OBS videos, if you do recordings, into a folder of their own. So you might create a folder and then you can browse to that folder. So you can pick any other folder that you want. So I'm gonna leave this on videos here. For the recording format, by default here it is set as MKV. If you click here, you see different file formats, video formats you might be familiar with. FLV, MP4, MOV is basically standard for QuickTime, basically the Apple standard for videos. TS and M3U8, so these are more exotic ones. What I would recommend here is leave it on MKV. Why? Because the thing is, when you are recording something in OBS and you have selected MKV as the output file format, and if your OBS is crashing, then all the work up to that point of the crash is preserved in an MKV file format. So you don't have to redo all the work again. You might just add the other part of the recording, and then in a video editing software you put those two together, make another video, or make one video again. If you select MP4, you have the problem, and it's actually you're being warned here that this will be the case. Recording saved to MP4 MOV, so the MOV file format is the same issue, will be unrecoverable if the file cannot be finalized. That means if your system crashes for some reason, and you know, we all know IT can do that very often. If you have a blue screen of death, that's the BSOD, so when your Windows crashes and you have this notorious blue screen, power losses, etc., then your entire recording becomes unusable. And that, if you have recorded, let's say, an hour video or 30 minutes of video, then this is unrecoverable. So I recommend leave it on MKV, and then you can, it's called remuxing, that basically OBS creates a second file out of the MKV recording and creates an MP4 recording at the end. That will save you a lot of trouble, a lot of heartache, and a lot of being annoyed, basically. So I would leave it at that. Let's change this here actually to something else. Let's change this to, depending on how much space you have on your hard drive, you can change this to high quality medium file size, indistinguishable quality large file size, so that's basically that's a medium quality setting, or lossless quality tremendously large file size. Unless you have really a lot of space on your hard drive, then I would stay away from the lossless quality, because these files can become enormously large. Even the indistinguishable quality produces, let's say, 10-minute videos, 15-minute videos that go into easily a couple of gigabytes. So what you can do is have a look at how much space you have, and if it's really not much, then stick with high quality. Otherwise, choose indistinguishable quality large file size. So I'm going to do that, and you can see that the encoder is once again suggested here. So I select, of course, my hardware encoder. That's the preferred option. But if you don't have a hardware enabled GPU, then you need to select one of the two other ones here. It's really up to you how busy your CPU is. So if I have a low spec system from the perspective of OBS, you might choose this option here that says software X264 low CPU usage preset increases file size. Otherwise, go for software X264. The next one we're going to look at is the audio. And you remember down here you saw that the audio mixer shows two audio inputs. One is for the desktop audio and one is for the microphone. Let me explain what you actually see here, what it actually means. It actually means that when you have here in the settings, when you have in the global audio devices, if you have enabled, in this case, the desktop audio is enabled up here, desktop audio, and the mic or auxiliary audio, that's basically your microphone, is also set as default. Everything else is disabled, so it's not shown here, down here. That means that these will be replicated. The desktop audio and the mic auxiliary audio will be replicated like this on every individual scene. However, what I personally prefer is that I have control over my audio in each individual scene myself. That means that I want to add or change the audio settings in each scene, and I can also show you later how to add a microphone to an individual scene as well. However, if you later find that you want the same settings, the same desktop audio and the same mic across all your scenes regardless, this is where you enable it. Yeah. So depending on what your desktop audio is, or what your inputs you have, so don't be concerned that I have that many here. This is really basically my system. You might have way less than that. So these options here indicate where my desktop audio is coming from. I disable this because I don't want that in my individual scenes. And I do the same with the microphone. So in my system, I have several microphone inputs. You might have one microphone input. That would be the default one most likely. So based on what Windows considers your default microphone. If you have a different one, you can select it here. Or in our case, we set this to disabled for now. So these are the audio settings. Double check if in the general tab up here, it says sample rate 48 kilohertz. And channel stereo, that's also coming from your system. You might have different settings if you've changed these earlier, or you might have the same here. I leave it as OBS has already pre-selected it. The last setting that we're looking at is the video settings. That's actually quite relevant because it will mostly depend on your computer screen. So what do I mean by that? You see, we have here two different resolutions here. And I mentioned them earlier when we were initially prompted and shown that we're using the virtual camera for OBS. So we have here the base canvas resolution, we have the output scaled resolution. The base canvas resolution, so the canvas, is basically your screen, the content where this is coming from. And this mostly refers to the screen resolution of your monitors that you have. You might only have one monitor, you might have dual monitors. I have a dual monitor setup. You might even have more than 2 monitors. 3 monitor setups, 4 monitor setups. This is all possible. However, the one that is most important is your main screen, and you need to figure out what is my resolution here. By default, the OBS selects typically 1020 by 1080 pixels. So how can you find out what your screen resolution is? It's actually very simple. To do so, you need to go back to the system settings. I still have them open here. And remember, this is where we checked what kind of version of Windows we have. You go back to home. Then you find your display, which is under system. So find the system entry, display. And display is the first option up here. And you see I have dual monitors here, so you will see however many monitors you have arranged. And then you need to have a look at your main monitor. So this is my main monitor, and here I have set, because of my specific monitor, a screen resolution of 2560 by 1140. This is what I'm setting my screen resolution OBS to as well, to avoid losses. So we're going to close that, going back to OBS, and we're going to change this to the higher resolution. However, I recommend the output resolution. So the resolution that OBS outputs. should be set to 1020 by 1080 because this is on most devices and provides the best scaled down quality for many devices when you're broadcasting or when you're recording and then uploading it. However, if you have any reason why you want to have this scaled down even more, and one of the reasons might be that you don't have a lot of space and you want to save on file size, you can go down. Yeah, you can go down to other settings. They should have the same ratio to one another, but a very common setting is 1280 by 720 or even 928 by 522. But I keep it on this output, so that is the output resolution that OBS will produce for video output. So for the downscale filter, the downscale filter is the filter that helps for the downscaling from the canvas to the scaled resolution. And by default, it offers the bicubic downscale filter. That's the sharpened scaling in 16 samples. Don't worry, that's technological lingo here that we don't really need to know about. However, I already have my eye on recording a lot, so here you see when you click on the down arrow, you see you have several options here. There's a couple of suggestions what these do. So if you select bilinear, it says it's the fastest one for downscaling, but it's blurry if scaling, so you might not want to do that. Area is a way to sum, so the more samples it uses, basically, the samples indicated here, that means the better the quality. The bicubic was the default sharpened scaling. The Lanchos or Lanxos, not sure how it's pronounced, but the last option here is the one that is recommended if recording is quite eminent. Yeah? So you might experiment with those filters. Of course, it will impact on speed of output generation in OBS. I set this to this recommended filter, and you might leave the FPS values, which is frames per second. So how many frames per second are being put in the video. The more frames per second, the smoother the movements. The lower, the more disrupted the movements look. 30 is perfectly fine. You can change it up to 60. But it's not really necessary to do that. We leave it at 30 and we should be good to go. So we can apply all this. That would not change any settings here. You see that once I clicked apply or OK, it does the same thing, just OK closes the settings window as well. You probably noticed that my audio mixer is now blank. Why? Because I have earlier disabled all global audio devices as I explained. I click OK, and these are now my base settings in the background. Based on these settings, we will create our sources, our scenes, and compose our 3 scenes with the screen components that I have shown you earlier. So there you go. That's the basic and initial settings that we're gonna use for our tutorial here in this video series covered. Once you dive deeper into OBS, you will have a look at these in more detail. So we will learn more about what individual settings mean, what they are, and what they change. For now, we are fine. We're good to go in order to start setting up our scenes and sources, learn about scenes and sources in the next video. Now over to you. As usual, I have a question of the day. What computer are you planning to run OBS on? Would you need to upgrade, or would it be fine with what you have? Comment below and let me know. If you have any questions about anything I mentioned in this video, please feel free to leave a comment as well. By the way, if you liked this video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, and turn on that notification bell to get the latest tips and tutorials to help you build your digital teaching and learning presence. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay hungry for new skills. Bye!